السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. التحديات الأمنية التي تواجه العالم في تغير مستمر، تهديدات متقلبة وغير مرئية. أمن المعلومات وأمن الفضاء الالكتروني يقودان مضجع الدفاع الاستراتيجي في دول كبرى. هل حرب الفضاء الالكتروني باتت الوجه الجديد للصراعات اليوم؟ أمن الفضاء الالكتروني وسياسات الدفاع البريطانية من الداخل. معكم زينب الصفار، تابعونا. هو من تمتع بعشرات السنين من الخبرة في وايت هول أو الحكومة البريطانية وما يحيط بها، ومن أبرز العقول المعنية برسم السياسة والاستراتيجية على أعلى المستويات في بريطانيا وفي العالم، وهو مبتكر برنامج أمن الفضاء الالكتروني في وزارة الدفاع البريطانية، والمسؤول الأول عنه هو اللواء المتقاعد جوناثان شو. الميجر جنرال شو خاض حروبا عدة في موقع القيادة، منها حرب جزر الفوكلاند ضد الأرجنتين عام 82 وحرب كوسوفو، ورأس الفرقة المتعددة الجنسيات في البصرة في العراق عام 2007. تولى قيادة الأركان من أيلول سبتمبر 2007 حتى آذار مارس 2009، حيث أصبح مساعد رئيس الأركان الدفاع لشؤون سياسة الأمن الدولي، وفي 2011 عين مساعد رئيس أركان الدفاع للقضايا العالمية، حيث تمحورت مسؤولياته حول سياسة مكافحة انتشار الأسلحة البيولوجية والكيميائية والإشعاعية والنووية، ومراقبة التسلح والفضاء الإلكتروني. اللواء شو، ما تعريفه لحرب الفضاء الإلكتروني؟ وما مدى إمكانية مواجهة تحدي تقني كهذا اليوم؟ وما الأضرار الناتجة عن الهجمات الإلكترونية في مواقع عدة؟ وكيف يرى التحديات المستقبلية في المنطقة والعالم اليوم؟ وما قراءته للحوار الأمريكي الإيراني بعد قطيعة طويلة؟ Major General Jonnathan Shaw, recently retired Assistant Chief of Defence Staff in the Ministry of Defence in the UK and former head of the cyber security at the Ministry of Defence. We are so happy to host you, sir, on
Very
the
nice
inside.
to be here. Thank you.
You're most welcome. Well, Mr. Shaw, you were the creator and first head of the Defence Cybersecurity Program. Being as such, we all know that cybersecurity is a very hot topic, yet not so many people know about and know what it exactly means, and also the challenges perhaps it faces, knowing that the Strategic Defence and Security Review identified cyber warfare as Tier 1 that the UK faces.
Yes, and I think the first thing to say about that is that cybersecurity is only a small part of the issue. The real challenge that we all face, both in defence and across government, but actually for every member of all our populations, is what I would call the challenge of living in the digital age. Because we are living now, all of us, in what I would refer to as the fourth information revolution. First of all, we had speech, then we had writing, then we had the printing press, and now we have the digital revolution, which is just exploding the amount of information and the way we use information, and hence the way we live our lives. And this is something that we have all leapt on board. We all of us have mobile phones, we all of us have computers. We're all taking advantage of the advantages of the digital age. And it is only latterly that we've realized that with these advantages come disadvantages. That actually these digital mechanisms we have all taken
Devastating
on board,
disadvantages.
and that's suddenly why cybersecurity has become such a big part of the problem. But I think there's some key fallouts from that. First of all, cybersecurity isn't just something that concerns governments, it concerns all of us as individuals. And also it's all about balancing the advantages against the disadvantages of the cyber technology. Because the key thing to note about the phrase cyber security is that actually what we're really talking about there is information insecurity. Because to define the word cyber, as soon as we use the word cyber, most people in the population just switch off because it sounds like a technical term. Actually, all that cyber means is the space between connected computers. It's this new thing called cyberspace. And the really important thing is the information that passes in it. And just the key point about that is that this cyber technology that allows information to pass so quickly, this technology is itself fundamentally insecure. And so, although we all ask for cyber security, what we're really talking about is how we manage information insecurity.
Is it difficult to have security in the cybersphere?
Well, this is the point. There is no such thing as absolute security in the cybersphere.
There's no firewall, you mean, in place?
Nothing is, every defense on its own. You cannot simply buy security in that sense, because sooner or later the opponent will get round it. We'll come up with a new firewall. It's a constant game. So the first thing we need to recognize with cybersecurity is that it's not about just simply buying in security. It's about managing the risk. And risk management is a different approach. It's a different psychological approach to any aspiration to complete security, because there is no such thing as complete security in cyberspace.
Sir, allow me here to ask you, what has the UK Ministry of Defence done so far in securing its cyber sphere? I mean, you know, some technical, perhaps, steps on the ground. Have they worked on this issue, perhaps? Because you have a division of it.
Well, for a long time we've been we've been concerned about the security of our communication systems, and so all this has done has added impetus to and added investment to putting more money into securing our networks as far as possible. But we need to be clear what we mean by securing our networks, given that we know there's no such thing as absolute security. It's about installing monitor systems in your system to know when you've been penetrated, as far as you can possibly gather. It's about having redundancy within your system so that you can repair damage caused by incursions in your system. It's about having alternative ways of doing business so that when one collapses you can move to another. It's about having certain reserve capability that can go in and patch up a damaged system and recover it and get it back working again. And it's also, of course, about monitoring what goes out of your system. Because quite a lot of what are now called advanced persistent threats are so technically advanced that you'll never know you have them in your system. Which is why one of the worries about cybersecurity is you never know whether you've been penetrated or not. So what are we doing? We're spending money putting new technology in. We're spending money training individuals so that they themselves are much better trained at cybersecurity and make it more difficult for the hackers and our opponents to get into our systems.
But despite all this, sir, the Ministry of Defence was hacked.
Of course, this is no surprise. We should not be surprised at this. This is part of the mental adaptation to the fact that we are now dependent on systems that are not secure. And we need to get used to this idea that hacks will happen. The question is not whether you get hacked or not. We should all expect to be hacked. The question is, how do you react once you've been hacked? How do you recover your systems? How much do you limit the damage? How much do you learn from it? And how much do you respond? And so this is a completely different mental response to one that just relies on a solid static defense. And we need to get used to that idea. And as I say, this is true for individuals as well as governments, because we all face our systems being taken down. So it's a really big
threat.
It's a really big threat, and we all need to just manage this threat. We all have a responsibility.
How do you devise, sir, responding to the new challenges through the cybersphere?
Well, let us talk conceptually about it, because this was I was in charge for the first 2 years, and so we were really at the conceptual stage. You realise that what you need to do, certainly for a Ministry of Defence, but I think this is true for everybody, you need to have reconnaissance so you understand the area you're operating in. You need to understand who's out there operating perhaps against you. You need all the normal intelligence analysis to work out who your opponents are and who might be trying to get into your system. You then need your indicators within your system that can indicate when you've been penetrated, and all those systems that I spoke about earlier, the technical systems which we'll leave to our technicians to sort out. But critically, This is not just a problem for our technologists. This is not a problem that companies, that defence organisations can delegate to their technical people, because most of the real problems in risk management are concerned with human judgments.
Sure.
And so you need to, the board, who are non-technical people, need to prioritise the value of their various information assets, and they need to protect them accordingly.
Right. Now, a former US Foreign Service officer, Jim Lewis, he told Reuters, quote, "It's like the nuclear program. It isn't particularly sophisticated, but it moves forward every year." How far do you agree with him?
Yes and no. I think actually the parallels with the nuclear threat are overblown. And the reason I say that is for two reasons. One, because the very simple reason that the technology moves on much faster in cyberspace than it moved on in the nuclear world. But perhaps more significantly, it's because the cyberspace is not a domain just for states. Nuclear technology is so complicated, it's so big, that the only players in the nuclear game were states. And so you knew who the people were. It was a very limited number of actors in the nuclear world. The point about cyberspace and cyber technology in the digital age is that the technological entry level is very low. This is a game for everybody. It's one person with a computer at dead of night in their own room. Anyone can play. This is a game for everybody. And that means that the challenge, add that to the speed at which it's developing, it means it's a much bigger problem. And it's a much more generalized problem than the nuclear threat.
Right. You have led or fought lots of wars, like the wars in the Falklands, and you went also to Iraq and Kosovo, and you also became in charge of the British military cyber warfare strategy, or as you prefer to call it, the war pursued in the cyberspace, or as the Chinese say, the unrestricted war. How was it easy or difficult for you, or how do you find that conventional armies can adapt to such kind of strategy, moving from,
I think the important thing is not really to think of cyber war. I prefer, the problem with talking about cyber war is it immediately, you imagine a sort of hermetically sealed, self-contained theatre of operations. And life isn't like that. The really important thing about cyberspace is what happens in the real world. To take an example, when Estonia was taken down by people who we cannot definitively say, but most popular journals would say it was the Russians that were attacking them in 2007. The reaction, I spoke to the Prime Minister of Estonia at a conference, and he said to me, I didn't bother with what was happening in cyberspace. That was just a means to the end. The really important thing was what was happening physically on the ground, and how the people were reacting, and the physical manifestations of the problem. And I think the really important thing for defence organisations, for all organisations, is to see what's happening in cyberspace as part of real life, not separate to it.
Yeah.
Which is why when the Americans felt particularly threatened by what was happening in cyberspace, they come up with the rather threatening statement that if they suffered a big attack through cyberspace, they would be happy to respond with a big bomb and treat it as an act of war, and would attack using all means possible.
So it's a kind of weapon. It's a tool
it's another tool in the golf bag.
Yes.
So it needs to be seen as part of, and so we need to recognise that actually dropping a big bomb on a server is a weapon of cyber war, because you're debilitating someone's ability to operate in cyberspace.
Sure. Right, Mr. Jonathan, we're going to stop now for a short break, but then when we come back we'll talk about the global challenges facing the whole world. The Inside will be back after the break. Stay tuned.
مراسل الأخبار في شبكة CBS الأمريكية جون ميلر، وفي مقابلة مع الرجل الثاني في وكالة الاستخبارات الأمريكية مايك موريل في 15 من سبتمبر أيلول 2013، سأله إذا ما أرسلنا صواريخ كروز إلى سوريا فإن أحد ردود الفعل لن يكون رد فعل عسكريا بالمعنى التقليدي أبدا، بل سيكون هجوما عبر فضاء السايبر. فأجاب موريل:
What I think you're likely to see from Iran and Hezbollah would be asymmetric attacks, cyber attacks. And I think the decision would be made in Tehran, not in Damascus.
فقدرات إيران تتنامى يوميا فيما يتعلق بالسايبر، وعليك القيام بأمرين لإلحاق الضرر بسوريا. عليك أن تمتلك الأدوات المناسبة والمنفذ، وهو الجزء الأصعب. اللواء البريطاني المتقاعد جوناثان هل يرى أن قدرة الهجوم عبر فضاء السايبر وصلت إلى هذا الحد من الجدية اليوم؟
It's another weapon, it's developing. I mean, it's another way of achieving effect. So clearly all countries are exploring this, more countries than actually admit it. So I think we just need to be honest about that. And also, again, go back to normal conventional theories about defence. If once you know there is no such thing as pure defence, then you need to be able to what we call manoeuvre in cyberspace. You need to be both able to attack and defend. You need to attack bad systems inside your system. You probably also need theoretically to be able to attack systems outside your own system, so something that's attacking it, to take it out at source. And that's how you manoeuvre in cyberspace. So the fact that countries are developing offensive cyber capability should not take us by surprise. In fact, we should be surprised if they weren't. The fact they're not admitting to it, many countries, is precisely because it's actually a very complex legal area and we haven't yet worked out the full conceptual package. So I think governments feel a bit naked or open to challenge that they don't quite know the answers to. But nonetheless, I think all governments, or most governments, are doing it. So, to go back to your question, I think the response from the man in the CIA was absolutely right. You do need something. You need technology and you need the access, and the human access is very difficult because to give the initial sort of response that you came up with earlier about building firewalls and air gaps, you can cross those by human beings is the simple way of doing it. And I think this is one of the great truths about cybersecurity, is that actually the more technical security measures we put in place, the more it will be the human element that's the weak link. And that's true of domestic security, it's true of commercially, but it's also true, of course, in terms of international, inter-nation competition. And if you look at the stories about Stuxnet, you know, the
worm that attacked Iran's centrifuges.
That's right. So there was a system that I can only presume was very heavily air-gapped and very heavily defended technically, and yet a worm was inserted, one can only presume, by a human agent getting in there and inserting the worm in there physically. So again, it comes back to my point earlier that cyber war should not be treated as a discrete technical area, because actually it has to be played as part of just one golf bag that only works properly in conjunction with all the other agencies of state power.
Right. Now, sir, you were one of the smartest minds in the Ministry of Defense. This is how people looked at you. And you had your own, people resorted to your own analysis of the policies, both nationally and internationally. Now, how do you see the future challenges hitting the region?
I'm just getting this growing sense from what I read in the press that we're at a bit of a turning point at the moment. But there's a very optimistic sign. I think two things have happened, and they may be joined or may not. I think the United States' openness to talking to Iran has opened up a whole set of opportunities. And then the public statements that seem to recognize that Al-Qaeda is now the biggest threat in the world, not Iran. I think it completely alters it has the potential to completely alter the security priorities of governments, and it alters the way that people the sort of alliances that we should be making, and the way we should view other countries. And I think if you start reorienting the people's policy priorities, it should get countries to completely alter their mindset and the way they look at people. All too easily, for years we have treated certain people as enemies, certain people as threats. And of course, as soon as you call people enemy or threats, you block off all kinds of opportunities. Just as America labelled Iran on the axis of evil, so Iran...
But they are talking to the Iranians now, and there's a kind of repression.
And so Iran used to talk about the great Satan for America, and they used to talk about Britain as little Satan. The trouble with that sort of language is that it reinforces a sort of separateness and an opposing viewpoint that's unhelpful. What I think we need to do now is actually think again, think seriously about this problem.
But why now? I mean, there are also, yes, Mr. Shaw, that there are also certain leaks that say that the communication between the US and Iran started back in May 2012. Why did the Americans want to communicate with the Iranians, and why did the Iranians respond positively to this communication? Is it about time, like, let's sit on the table and let's find a solution and we are not the threat?
Well, I think that there are, why do politicians change their mind? I can't answer that question.
Common interest, perhaps.
I would hope it's common interest, but I mean, to my mind, reading some books, you'd say that we have been here before. We were here in the early part of the last decade, when opportunities arose on the table. I think 2003 the offers were put on the table. They were rejected because the political mood in capitals, particularly in the West, was not propitious to that, was not open to those sort of overtures. I think that you add to that 10 years where the military instrument, as we've deployed from the West, has proved itself not to be very effective in achieving political change. I think there's been a lack of confidence now in the military instrument, and therefore a reversion to political talks as a way of resolving issues.
And perhaps the American public cannot stomach any more wars, perhaps.
I think that's absolutely right. I think this is one of the things that's happened. In 2003, when the offer was apparently last on the table, we were just at the start of the global war on terror. There was still a sort of a feeling in the West that the military instrument could achieve the political aim desired. And I think what we've learnt over the last 10 years that the military instrument is very good at destroying regimes, but it's very bad at creating new politics. And it's new politics we need. And so I think, as a military man, I absolutely welcome the return of politics to centre stage, and therefore the need to talk to people, to manage situations.
Now, will a partial settlement between America and Iran be sufficient?
There are so many value judgments in that statement, I can't give you a clear answer. My own sense, though, is that if you follow the implications of what I just said about the lack of confidence in the military instrument and the lack of domestic enthusiasm for using it, I think it alters the options that lay on the table. And I think that even a so-called partial option would need to be pursued to try and come to a better answer. I don't think anyone, the nature of politics is that no one gets totally everything they want.
I mean, is the US capable of more? In this dossier, the US-Iran relations?
We shall see. I don't know. Right. I would hope so, but then so is Iran. I mean, I think for both countries, both of them have two problems. They have a problem of making an arrangement with themselves, but also these administrations have a problem with their hard lines back at home.
Yes.
And so it's a very complex negotiation. And we shall see where it goes. But I think these things develop a momentum that change events. So it's almost pointless trying to speculate.
Yes. Do you think the UK was instrumental in trying to avert a war against Syria because of the decision taken by Cameron not to go to war?
I think it's had a remarkable effect. And I think. My judgment on what happened in the House of Commons that night when they voted not to support Cameron's motion or the government's proposed motion was a realisation that there was a lack of connection between the military tool that was on the table and any feasible political end state. It just seemed to people that this was almost gesture politics. And I think, bearing in mind the experience of what's happened in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the fact that the military instrument is a very poor instrument for achieving political change, I think there was that lack of strategic thought as presented by the government, which the parliamentarians rejected. And I think that played very strongly in the United States, where I think the strongest motive was not necessarily the lack of strategy, but just the war weariness amongst the American population.
What's your stance vis-à-vis interventionism? This kind of policy, yes.
I think that where we stand at the moment is that we stand at the end of a rather strange, aberrant period of history, which you might call a period of liberal interventionism, which was an idea first sprung on the world well, I won't say first sprung, but inspired by Prime Minister Blair's Chicago Doctrine speech early on in his presidency, based on the success of the military in restoring stability to Sierra Leone, and the success of the military in changing the politics of Kosovo. I think there's a misreading of those two operations, and I think we leapt from that to thinking that the military instrument was a good tool for achieving political change, and that linked to the neocon idea of exporting democracy, which came after 9/11, and it's sort of linked to the whole need for revenge attack against Afghanistan for supporting and harbouring Al-Qaeda, etc., etc. And I think it's led to this belief in exporting democracy to Iraq, led to that invasion, this belief in the military instrument, and I think now we've lost that belief, and I think my own sense is that the idea of liberal interventionism is dead, and I think it's been particularly the final nail in the coffin was Libya, where perhaps reluctantly Western powers got involved, but certainly France and Britain did get involved enthusiastically to try and change, get rid of Gaddafi, who, let's remember, a few weeks before had been our close ally on two key strategic dynamics: one, counter-proliferation, and two, the fight against Al-Qaeda. But nonetheless, we went in and supported knocking him over, and yet what we've seen subsequently
and there was
chaos.
also an arms deal between the UK
there were
and
all sorts
Libya.
Of deals. Of course there were all sorts of political deals done with the old regime. So there were many of us back in Britain at the time who were quite sceptical about the operation in Libya, and if you look at the outcomes, particularly the assassination of the American ambassador. I think this has put a real scare down. I think it has made people realise that although we may not like certain governments in the world, there is something worse than a bad government, and that's no government. That chaos is in the interests of nobody.
Because the alternative is still
Because the alternative is chaos, and I think where we are now is a lack of enthusiasm for intervention. If the aim of intervention is to change things and make things better. But I think what we're still seeing...
They are still talking now about a military option is still on the table when it comes to Syria. So is your stance going to be the same? I think some people are saying that, but until you've got a very clear political objective to aim for, military intervention remains an excuse. Military operations without political plan is a folly, is a mistake, is a waste of effort, it's a waste of resource, it's a waste of lives. Yes, sir, well, this is a very long debate. Major General Joonathán recently retired Assistant Chief of Defence Staff in the Ministry of Defence in the UK and former head of the cybersecurity at the Ministry of Defence. Super, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.
You're most welcome, sir. إذا لقاء جديد في الأسبوع المقبل مع ضيف جديد وقضية جديدة ودائما من الداخل. للمزيد من التواصل بريدنا theinside@almayadeen.net من كل فريق عمل من الداخل من كل الميادين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.